Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. Robbie, brilliant to have you here today. And to kick off with, and do you see what I did there? Please introduce yourself and tell people about the great work that you do.
Hey, Alan. Yeah, great to be here. Very fun. So my name is Robbie Swale. I think about myself and my work in different ways, but these days, slightly confusingly and annoying for branding purposes, and maybe I need to do something about that. There are three parts to my work, really. So there's a part of my work which is about creativity and helping people, particularly the bit of creativity I'm interested in is why do we sometimes really want to do something and not do it for a long time, and then sometimes we finally do the thing, and how do you bridge that gap? And that's what the part of my work branded under the 12-minute method is about. It's a series of 4 books that people can find on Amazon and other places, starting with how to start when you're stuck. So creativity is one part of my work. I'm really interested in the craft of coaching. So if there are any coaches listening, watching, then you can find loads of resources for coaches at thecoachesjourney.com. And that's just because I think that the craft of coaching has a huge amount to offer. The challenges we face in the world in all kinds of ways. And so there's a podcast there, there's videos, there's articles, there's all kinds of collected resources. And then somewhat secretly, which is a bit of, again, like this is the branding problem really, most of my work is for leaders. So most of the actual work that I do is with helping leaders who are facing in complex roles, trying to work out how do I succeed in the face of the kind of chaos of complexity without having to compromise who I am as I do that. And that's for me where some of the values work that I do comes in, because often what can we do? Well, we can't guarantee our success when we're wrestling with whatever business or organizational or personal challenge we're dealing with. We can't guarantee the success, but we can guarantee that we stay true to ourselves and our values in those moments, and therefore maybe get some peace for ourselves at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe that, Robbie, because I feel the same way, and I feel a branding dilemma because of the variety of stuff that I get involved in. But hearing you talk about it makes me wonder whether it is, in fact, something that is developing and becoming more common. And the antithesis of that, I'm thinking, you meet somebody and they say, "I'm an accountant," and that's easy to understand. Whereas people in the modern world, I think, probably have more diverse interests, and so there I don't know, intuitively, it just feels that are probably more and more people like you and I that are involved in more than one dimension.
Yeah, and then it's also interesting, of course, because it's also a choice by the accountant, right? To say, I'm an accountant. I could have just said, I'm a coach, but
Yeah.
that doesn't feel like it gives the texture to what I do. And the other thought that I had just as you were speaking then is I kind of think if you've been knocking around doing, any kind of work for a while and you're interested in trying to tell the story, then you're going to have a few chapters to that story. And in a way, that's what, I've just talked about probably the 2 last chapters of big focus for my work, the 12-minute method and the coach's journey. And then the next one, which, has always been the center, like I say, the core of my actual day-to-day work with clients, but has not been very public. So there's not much like, there's not a website for, I mean, there is for my coaching, but there isn't one with a neat title
Yeah,
for
sure,
the leadership
sure.
work. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's a mixture of maybe also what's happening is that, yeah, the internet means that we can actually see the work that people are doing now. And so we know that it's more textured than before. Whereas, 30 years ago, I don't know how you'd have told that story because you wouldn't have had a website. I guess you'd have had a series of books or, brochures or whatever it might have looked like.
Mm. So I'm really curious to see what card we're going to draw. So I'm going to tip the cards out, and then how many piles would you like me to make?
Let's do 5.
5 piles, okay. And they're going to be different sizes. Um, so So there we go, 5. And so now from my left to my left is number 1 and my right is number 5. So which pile would you like?
4.
You're a good man, Robbie, because that's one of the smaller piles, which means that I
Okay.
don't have to count so many cards. So we've got 8. So a number between 1 and 8.
Well, let's do number 7 for important reasons, which we were talking about before we switched on the recording as well.
Okay, well, let's see where we go with this. Safety is the card
Ah.
that we're going to play with.
Hmm.
And the first question is actually the pre-first question is, what's the reason that you chose that card?
Well, Um, we had a little brief conversation about both having the dubious these days pleasure, but past great pleasure of being Manchester United followers.
Yeah.
And I realized when I chose five, I was like, it was kind of it could have been a Lee Sharp from the 90s reference, but it wasn't. But then when you said there were eight left, I thought I have to choose seven for its somewhat, I think somewhat mythical, but also somewhat real association with Eric Cantona
Yeah,
and that Portuguese guy, I guess, as well.
we'll leave those people that know to smile and those people that don't to either be curious or not be bothered.
Exactly. All welcome, both of those. Beckham as well. I should have said Beckham, really, shouldn't I, for number seven, especially with that documentary around if people want to watch that. But yes, I've
Very
got to.
good
Yeah.
documentary. Very good documentary, I thought. So the first question for our values jam, Robbie, is what does safety mean? And what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Yeah. I think it's like a. I mean, the first thing that just came to me is I love that it's in that. Like one of my favorite things about doing the work that I've ended up doing is getting to hear people talking about the values that they have that I don't have, and really getting an appreciation for how things that don't appear at the near the top of my list can be incredibly well valued for other people. And so when I noticed safety came out, I was like, that's so interesting because that wouldn't be one of my values. I mean, in a second, I'm going to talk about what a big part it plays in my life in lots of ways, but it wouldn't be. And I just got this little flash of love for all the people out there for whom that might be one of the cornerstones that they kind of move their life around. So safety, I mean, what it comes up for me is it is like it's underneath safety. Despite what I've just said, it is underneath a real driver. Whenever I find it under my fears and worries all the time. Um, and so often I'm a little judgmental about that in myself because I know on some level, and it's not all bad judgment, but I know on some level that my fears about safety are are kind of unfounded. Like I'm afraid for safety in a situation where on all objective levels I am safe. Whereas our ancestors from many millennia ago wouldn't have been safe. I mean, even 100 or 80 years ago, right? We might have been having this. We wouldn't we wouldn't be having this conversation because we'd be worried that the other side of the war might be listening in, and obviously also because we didn't have Zoom. But so it's like there's that sense that really I am safe, and yet psychologically I don't always feel safe. And so then to give that for me that sense of what the question, what does it feel like? What does it look like? Was that right?
Yeah, so the two parts of the question really are one, what does it mean? And we've started to get into that, and then the other is more of a metaphoric angle. So it's when you think of the word safety, what images come to mind, what sounds come to mind, and what feelings come to mind.
Yeah, on the second one, it's in a way easier. I mean, I have for me, it's a kind of warm, cozy, um, cuddled up feeling. And I've been doing some of the work that I'm doing on myself at the moment is about that in some ways. It's about the really little me and where was the space of repair and renewal for me. As we moved into the work that one of the work that I'm doing, I do some work with. She calls herself a biographical counselor, so it's inspired by Rudolf Steiner in some ways, and so we're looking at my biography as a way to understand myself now. And so we've done a little work on this recently, so it's really fresh for me. Where was the renewal, the safety, the kind of uh, the rejuvenation, refueling time for me when I was little? And I got this great picture of in my mind. This image appeared straight away of kind of on the armchair we used to have an open fire in this kind of drafty farmhouse that I grew up in North Yorkshire, and cuddled up with my mum. I mean, it probably wasn't, it's probably like 5, 6 at this point. I don't know. I don't think it's a real memory. It's just this image reading. We would be reading together at that time, and with the warm fire and probably the cold outside. So that's that really evocative thing came up for me straight away when you asked what does it feel like? What does it look like? What does it sound like? So it could be the crackles of the open fire. It could be, it's interesting. My wife really loves this. She loves it when it rains really hard and we're not out in it, right? So you can hear the
Yeah.
sound of rain on the windows. So that's almost the sound of safety is there's something that isn't quite safe nearby, but I'm not in it. which is, which gives you that sense of, I guess, yeah, I guess I'm just catching it. In some ways, safety exists. I wonder if this is true only in opposition to danger. I don't know if that's true, but it feels like it probably is. So I
Yeah.
wonder if you have to know on some level that danger exists to know that you're safe. I don't know if that's true.
And there's a whole lot to what you just said here that is interconnected and coming together to to create a few thoughts. So when you started to explain your thoughts around safety first off, uh, I wholeheartedly agree. When I saw the card, I thought, oh, well, that's going to be interesting, but it's not kind of, oh, yes, look at that. And then when you started to talk about what safety meant to you, one of my immediate questions was, um, why does it seem to be more of a challenge to explore safety than it is to explore the opposite of safety, which is risk and danger? I find it a lot easier to get involved with risk and danger than I do with safety. Um, and then a word that hasn't come up yet that comes to my mind is that of protected. So when I think of safety, I think of, it's somebody else or an environment that's providing it for you. It's not something that you've necessarily created yourself. And to your final point, it seems to be easier to understand when you do consider the alternative, so the pouring rain on the other side of the window, than if you just try and think of safety when you're on this side of the window and there is no rain. And that final thought on this is that it leads me to think of a parallel between uh, our feelings for this word, safety, and another one, well-being. During COVID, I think people realized that they couldn't take it for granted as much as perhaps previously they had done. And perhaps there's something similar with safety here, where because we're fortunate to be in a privileged position in our society and in our lives, perhaps we don't really give it due credit and due importance.
Yeah, it does feel, one of the thoughts that went through my mind when you were speaking then is, yeah, like I love that inquiry. Like, why is it not one that we're like, why does it feel harder to talk about than risk and less exciting, really? And I think it's partly because it isn't really cool. Like that, and I suspect that is we um partly because we take it for granted, and partly because we just don't like so I think some of that not being cool is wise, right? And of course I think that because my books, the 12-minute method books, for example, they're about using courage as a way to make things. Because too often the way that, I told that story about feeling safe psychologically, right? It's like I have all these fears. They're mostly not about real safety.
Yeah.
They're about me in some ways. The way I would think about it is my evolutionary background getting a bit short-circuited by how visible we are in the world. So we then I think I'm unsafe because somebody on LinkedIn might judge me. But the truth is, I'm not really unsafe, and it doesn't really affect me. It's not going to affect any of my material life if somebody on LinkedIn thinks I'm an idiot. And so I'm much better off to share the thing that I'm afraid of sharing. Right.
Mhm.
So that I agree with all that, and I think that is wise. But I think there is something, I think you're absolutely right that there's something we take for granted about that safety. And when it is taken away, the pandemic being a good example of that, or it feels like it's taken away for a lot of people, there's suddenly a higher risk for a big number of people, um, literal risk around. I think that really showed us that well, it showed us lots about how we deal with danger and how important safety is to people and the lengths we're willing to go to protect it.
Mm.
But then I think even if we take out the extreme example of the pandemic, one of the problems with not valuing safety is probably seen, for example, you mentioned well-being in the kind of, they talk about it as a kind of burnout epidemic, don't they? If we think about my work with my biographical counselor, and we also think about I got this flash when you mentioned the rain on the other side of the windows. You reflected that back to me. I was thinking about, for some reason, I had this idea of a journey, right? And it's like the nighttime bit of a long journey. You have to somehow, if it's a stormy day, you have to huddle up somewhere and be safe while you sleep and recover.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a real problem that we value risk and courage and those things very highly. And broadly in society, it's not so cool to like safety, because actually, if that might be what's causing people to overstretch themselves, to not rest enough, to not be concerned enough to have these breaks, these stopping points on their journeys.
I think that's a great point, and it's really spooky because the first time you mentioned courage, around about 10 or 15 seconds before that, I'd written the word courage down.
Hmm.
And the reason that I did that was when you were talking about safety, I was thinking actually safety begets courage, because when you feel safe, you feel braver and more capable. And we were talking about your young kids before we started the session. And I was thinking about my kids when they were learning to walk, and it's if you're there and you're going to stop them hurting themselves by falling over, then I remember them just trying, and going for it rather than having that fear that you might do something seriously bad to yourself and therefore I'm not going to do that. So this is kind of taking me to a place that is not only saying it's our bad for underestimating safety, but it's actually making me think that safety is hugely important and beneficial, actually.
Yeah, and both the example, yeah, that example with the children learning to walk is such a good one. There's like, because also if you have too much safety in that case, like if you hold their hands all the time, they never there's a point which they will never get past. So that there is some kind of like, I guess all values, I think this would be true of, but this one, it's really showing up, isn't it? Or it feels like it is in this moment. There's like an optimum level of safety. There's too much of a good thing. If we never, if I'm huddled up by the fire with the rain coming down and I never leave that room, then there's some parts of life and possibility and potential that are lost. But if there's never a room like that, then I'll die essentially. Like that's that's what it feels like to me. Sometimes when I've pushed myself too far, it's like I'm on the edge, and this is not, in some ways this is not real danger, but in some ways I think it is, and that's the kind of burnout question. And just to say that that's actually interestingly, like, and I love that this is happening. Like I say, I've got a series of 4 books about essentially creativity, doing these things that we're afraid of. And I've never really spotted. I mean, I do know this. Like, in fact, I've got a big page of notes somewhere with like for a potential podcast episode or article or something, which has a whole section about this. But I've never thought about it as having safety at its core. But one of the things that I've noticed helps people finally do things is creating, yeah, is like making it just manageable enough.
Yeah.
So just enough safety, essentially. Otherwise, it does feel impossible for us, even if there may not be a literal risk to us. It can feel emotionally, psychologically like there's a literally existential risk. That's what it can feel like. So you have to diffuse that just enough to be able to be courageous.
Yeah, and you're making me think here about the difference between real and perceived safety.
Hmm.
Because actually, again, when you're learning to walk or learning to ride a bike or whatever it is, you don't want to be cosseted because then you're not going to reach your potential, but you don't want to be put at risk either. And often that's in your head rather than a physical thing. By coincidence, I didn't learn to ride a bike when I was a child. I didn't have a bike, and many of my friends didn't either. And so I was petrified when, somebody said, "Oh, why don't you come ride a bike?" But the real risk was not as great as my perceived risk. And so, what would have been great at that time is if somebody had been there to say, well, come on, this is what you do. I'll hold the saddle for a bit and then maybe let go when I wasn't watching, that sort of thing. Um, so, and I think this relates to coaching in particular, where you can help people to realize the potential that they're capable of by helping them to feel safe in the first instance.
Yeah, and sometimes even, in a coaching conversation, like practice, in some ways that's what happens. And let me see if I can get this. If I'm with my coach or if a client is with me and they might be telling me something, and even the telling, by being heard in that moment, suddenly the thing becomes more real and more safe. And you can like I will sometimes help clients literally practice. It's not the same if they're doing a presentation which feels full of fear to somebody important in a couple of weeks. It's not the same to run some of it or talk it through with me. But having done that, there is this embodied sense of like, oh yeah, like a bit like you say, like, oh, getting on the bike is a thing I could do. And there's some greater level of safety having some embodied sense of what that might be like. Just a little what, because we're talking about bikes. It's so interesting. So I grew up in the countryside, and so I did learn to ride a bike a little later than some of my friends, but because like most of my actual friends lived like 5, 10, 12 miles away, it was essentially useless to be able to ride a bike because I was never going to ride 12 miles to see my friends. So I stopped riding for a long time. And in the pandemic, I got so stir crazy in the little corner of southwest London that I was living in at the time that I thought, well, maybe now's the time. And the only reason I think a really huge contributing reason to that was that I just really I'd read a couple of books, one of them Bounce by Matthew Syed, about the idea of practice. And so I went back to riding a bike with a really different mindset of like, oh yeah, I'm going to be quite bad at this at first. That's okay, but I will get better.
Yeah.
And as I get better, I'll be more capable and I can do slightly scarier things. So that I did, there was some valuing of safety there. I didn't, at first it was pretty hairy to get to the park from where I lived. And then in the park, it's a lot safer because there's no
Yeah.
cars.
Yeah.
And then after a while, and the pandemic was actually fantastic for this because the roads were really quiet in the lockdowns. I could actually like develop the confidence, build up my inherent sense of safety as I went. And that I think I've just done a thing there, which might be interesting. Is a confidence and safety connected? Feels like
Yeah.
they might be. Like I built those two things as I went, and as the world of London traffic came back, it meant that it's still a bit hairy. I wouldn't deliberately cycle around Hyde Park Corner or anything, but it's like I was able to build that sense of safety from somewhere where I mean, it wasn't quite that I'd forgotten how to ride a bike. Like I could still make it move, but I needed a lot of competence to be safe on the roads, and that came gradually.
Yeah. There's so many things that this is opening up. So one just now, when you were talking about safety, it reminded me of the importance of safety in the workplace, not from a people being at risk point of view, more from the point of view of having confidence to take action and feeling that they're not going to get blamed or told off. So here's a story. How can I tell this as quickly as possible? I was responsible for service delivery to a portfolio of corporate offices for a client organization. And our services were reception, catering, cleaning, security, all of those things. Um, the client told us that there was a, a cost reduction exercise, and we should therefore never put chocolate biscuits in the meeting rooms. The following day, I got a call from my client saying, I've just heard from somebody that there were chocolate biscuits in the meeting room. I told you yesterday that this shouldn't be the case. So I apologized, spoke to the catering guys, asked them to get it sorted. Then we had my client was the facilities management function, and they attended a meeting with the board. And guess what? There were chocolate biscuits in the meeting room. So this time they were really angry and annoyed, and they'd been shown up to their superiors. And I was really curious to find out what happened. So rather than just speak to the catering guy, I spent a bit more time investigating. What had happened was that the normal biscuits delivery hadn't been made because there'd been a flood in a warehouse somewhere. The guy that was looking after the meeting room had been on a customer service training program that we had put on the previous month when we were talking about how to go the extra mile and all of this stuff. So when he had no biscuits, he thought, I'll go round to Tesco's and get some biscuits. And because I'm going the extra mile, I get some chocolate ones. And so I remember speaking to him and say, because obviously there was a big fuss around this. But I said to him, always do the same again next time. And, I'm here to take the repercussions, but never change your attitude when you're dealing with customers. So that story, I think, is something about him in his position, the value of him feeling safe to be able to make that choice to deliver a great service rather than being worried about it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love the story. I love that guy. What a hero. And it's interesting. It reminds me. So one of the things that came up just before you told that story, and it's again, I love the synchronicity. So I watched I used to go to these in person when I lived in London. I watched this one online, a talk at the RSA with Amy Edmondson,
Yeah,
who is famous for essentially writing the book on psychological safety.
yeah,
Now, one of the interesting things she said in this talk more recently, which is about her book about failure, a more recent book, is she kind of got a little bit, she took that term, psychological safety, because it already existed in research. And so her work felt like it was about that. And she has a regret about it. She wishes she didn't, because people think that psychological safety means you're coddled and you never do anything unsafe, and you're never going to get into trouble or do anything wrong if you're in a psychologically safe environment. And you're never going to have disagreements because you're psychologically safe. And in fact, it's the opposite of all those things, right? The
yeah.
idea, I don't think she gave an alternative title that she'd like to have given it, but those things that she describes in that work on psychological safety, they in fact allow the opposite, right? They allow disagreement in a healthy way. They allow people to speak up in different ways. They allow for risk taking. And I guess what I love about what you did there, what I noticed you did with this guy with the chocolate biscuits, is you gave him back that space. So it could have been that you'd taken that away at that point, but instead what you said was, look, you were doing what we tried to train you to do. It's amazing. By the way, this other thing was happening over here, but what you did was fantastic. And so, yeah, I love it. And it just gives us that, again, that interesting flavor about safety, about how it is a vital component, I guess, for all these other things that we might be doing, like really doing great customer service. Actually, he had to he was doing it, he didn't necessarily know it because he hadn't had the memo perhaps about no chocolate biscuits, but he was taking a risk in service of the customer, in service of everyone having a better experience in line with his actual job, which is to help people have good meetings. And he must have felt that from the training or from you or from his team or whatever it was.
Yeah, and there's again, earlier when right at the beginning when we talked about how it was easier to consider the opposite, I think that this applies here as well because take a workforce where everybody is, walking on eggshells and not willing to make choices and decisions because they're fearful of the repercussions. That will not be a high performing team.
No.
Um, Equally, like you were saying about the walking with the baby and the riding the bike, you can't cosset your employees, so you can't wrap them up in cotton wool. But I think that the the mid place is something about, and actually this touches on the values work that we both do, um, providing them with this sense of safety through clear communication about the expectations, but the latitude for them to make their own decisions about how to apply that
Yeah.
rather than the alternative. And I've been out of the corporate world for quite some time, but still obviously work with clients in that space. And there are still so many organizations and by definition leaders in those organizations that seem to think that they can minimize the involvement of employees, take all of the decisions, and then just want them to be adhered to. And why do they think that that is going to have any hope of succeeding?
Yeah, I mean, why that answers that question is probably another hour, right? Like, but really interesting. And I think that I mean, again, there's kind of so much in there. I think that one of the things that I've really seen is yeah, what does that kind of thing create? That environment you just described, where the leader, you described two really great aspects of what a leader could do, which that example of the leader wouldn't. Which one is the clear communication of expectations. But again, we're talking about in some ways what we're talking about is values, right? Because you could or behaviors, however you like to call it, you could describe a clear expectations in terms of you will do this, then you will do that, then you will do the other. But instead, if you've got the expectations and then the latitude to apply it, and I think this is one of the things I love about that story, the confidence that your leader will back you if you've done those things, even if something has gone wrong.
Yep.
Now, that's not true in like all, it depends exactly on the job description, right? If, because there are some things, if someone is running, if we're talking about literal safety, for example, someone's running a crane and you've got to be really careful what your expectations are and the latitude that's given, right? Because you don't want someone
Yep.
smashing the wrong building or whatever it is. But in most jobs, there's space for lots of latitude. And in fact, I think what we see when we give that latitude, maybe I partly answer that question. Why does that leader think it'll work? I think it's like a misunderstanding of how complex the world is and how smart they are. So if you think the world is relatively simple and you are very smart, and then you probably think if I tell all these 50 people exactly how to act, that will work. But the problem is no one is that smart and the world isn't that simple. Well, I mean, again, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect because there probably are some jobs, some environments where it is controlled enough for that to work. But often this is a challenge leaders, I don't know about you, but that I work with face. They get to the point where that no longer works.
Yeah.
And then they run into this problem. So it works when I don't know, I've been promoted from being a developer to running a team of 5 developers working on this small part of this software, and that basically still works at that point. In fact, it's kind of my job to teach these other 5 developers how to develop better. Then I go up another level and it's too complex to do that, and I'm no longer close enough. I can't know the software well enough because I've got a team of 50. How can I possibly do it? And the only option there, as far as I can tell, is to move more to the kind of place where you were describing, which is have the clear expectations. It's okay if sometimes things don't go right. It's much better, in fact, if things don't go right than if you sit there doing nothing all day because we're worried about how it'll go. And so I guess I'm slowing it down in this moment. I do think that, yeah, how do I bring this in? So one of the thoughts I've had, which I kind of touched on at the start, is this idea that is that values do give us safety. So it's an interesting like little place we can go to here because we're talking about the value safety, but actually if I know that, and I think this really works on an individual level, if I know that at the end of the day, no matter how things have gone, and because I'm out of organizations now as well, it's mostly me that I have to answer to, right? At the end of the day, do I feel stressed and anxious if I've acted in line with my values that day? Not really, because long term, there's a kind of safety to that. It's like, well, I've kind of been the person that I wanted to be today, and maybe I didn't get that sale, but that's because I wasn't willing to compromise in those ways to get it. Or maybe I could have done something much better with that client, but I wasn't willing to compromise in those ways. So I'm not quite sure I'm quite getting it because I'm on the edge of my thinking here, I think. But there's some way in which those ideas about living our values, they're the answer to safety. But that's a load for me, Alan, and it's slightly garbled because, like I say, I'm at the edge of the
No,
thinking. So
no,
I'm
no.
curious what you're picking up.
Robbie, it's not well, it doesn't sound garbled, and you've reminded me of my eldest daughter went to some sort of personal development session that she shared with me, and I've remembered ever since, and I think is relevant to this. One of the exercises that they were invited to join in with was to just when they were going to be experiencing either a stressful or a challenging occasion. So, for instance, an interview or a meeting with a very senior person or something like this, they were encouraged to think of all of their successes and all of the great things that they had heard people say to them. And the facilitator described this as their dinosaur tale. And so the way she described it was, she said, this guy said, so you're standing here. All of that great stuff is in your dinosaur tail behind you, giving you the stability and slash safety. So, and values also, I get feedback from the work that I do in this space that when people either individually or in the workplace are clear about their values and clear about the associated behaviors to those values, it does give them, and you mentioned confidence and safety as being connected. You've mentioned the importance of practice. So if you practice those values-based behaviors, that's going to give you more confidence and feeling of safety. And that's going to provide you with resilience in tough times because you'll be able to fall back on that and know that you are behaving in this way because, and the reason why you are, and the reason why your colleagues around you are behaving in that way as well. So, yeah, I think what this conversation is doing for me is it's like safety is hidden away in the corner and you've got these more sexy words like confidence and practice and familiarity. But actually, safety is kind of holding them together.
Yeah. Yeah. Two things come up for me. So one is this idea, which I heard about, I was going to say, which I kind of heard about from the philosopher Ken Wilber, except I didn't. I heard about it from my dad, who had been reading a Ken Wilber book. And I don't know if this is a Wilber idea, because one of the things he does is pull in and integrate together lots of other people's ideas. But he had this idea that, and again, it's not his, but it's like that everything in it, everything in the universe has got an elements of stability and elements of novelty to it. And if you don't have both, we don't get life, right? And you don't get anything. So if you don't have any stability, then all the molecules in the world, in the universe, just dissipate,
Yeah.
right, into just a mess of molecules. But if you don't have any novelty, none of this exists because nothing can change and you just get complete stasis. And so it's the same as order and chaos. But it occurs to me that safety is another element of stability, that without some element of safety, nothing else is possible, essentially. So none of the other things, the sexier things, are possible. So that's one idea I want to put in. And then I'm going to put another one in. So the other one is, and I think this is really important from a complexity point of view. So from the fact that one of the things that often leaders, for example, that I'm working with are struggling with is how do I function in the complexity of my role and the world? And this is an idea from developmental psychology. So the idea would be there are some maps to how we develop our psychology as we grow. And I just caught that one of them is, it's about defining values is definitely part of it, but it also gives us safety. So sometimes we get to this place where we kind of progress to a certain level by they call this in the work of, so I learned this from a woman called Jennifer Garvey-Berger. She's a student of Robert Keegan, and it's his model. They were both out of Harvard, and they call it the socialized mind is the jargon for it, but it's basically the idea that part of how we make sense of the world as we grow up and become adults is we work out like, okay, how do I be a good employee, and how do I be a good husband or boyfriend or girlfriend or wife or whatever it might be? How do I be a good daughter? And we work out what is a good daughter in this part of society, or what is a good employee, or what's a good leader, and then we do that thing. And what happens sometimes is we realize our world gets a bit too complex to live like that, because I can't be a good employee who's supposed to stay until 7 p.m. every night and a good boyfriend who's supposed to be at dinner at 7. I can't do those things at the same time all the time. And that can feel really unsafe and incredibly stressful. And
Mhm.
one of the moves, as you move into something slightly different, and they think that the way Keegan calls it and Garvey-Berger is they call it the self-authored mind. That's the next level. So you develop some extra complexity fitness by defining, okay, rather than what is a good employee versus a good leader versus a good boyfriend versus a good wife, is what do I believe is the right thing to do in these situations? So again, it's that piece which is like, um, how do values give us a sense of safety?
Yeah.
I'm just seeing some of that as well. So again, sorry, those are two quite big ideas to bring in at once.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on the second one because what happens with ValuesJam, and you won't know this, but what happens during these conversations very regularly is that memories that haven't crossed either of the values jammers' minds for quite some time come forward. Now, a psychologist in New Zealand told me that maybe because values conversations are going deep, it might be something to do with lapsed neural pathways being reconnected and bringing a memory from the depths. So this has just happened to me now, and you talking about that example of being at work until 7 versus being with your partner at 7. So this was a lady in Hong Kong, and I was working with her on my 31 practices, which is, how do you bring your values to life, basically. And she told me a story about how she's got a photograph of her daughter when her daughter was 4 and her first visit to the local zoo with her nanny. And the reason it was with her nanny was because the lady decided to stay at a meeting that overran when she was supposed to go home and take her child to the zoo. And so she developed one of her practices now is that she sticks to meeting times even when they overrun. And so she's now developed the courage and feels safe enough to say, guys, we said we were going to finish this at 7. I'm due to be home with my daughter and I'm leaving now. So it is this. So how does that compare to the model and the terminology that you were using just now?
Yeah, I love the story. Um, yeah, I think she's really, I think that's, yeah, it's a great story to demonstrate that. She's really authoring her life at that point. She's bashing through this sense that a good employee never stops meetings, or a good leader, is always the last one there, or whatever story she had. And instead she's saying, well, look, actually, I guess she's saying, I wish I hadn't missed that trip to the zoo underneath. But what that creates, what I love about that, and I think this is for people who are listening who are kind of in that space, is such a good story because no one listening who's ever worked in an organization doesn't wish more meetings had finished on time, right? Everyone listening knows that it is a scourge of their diary, their day, their sense of stress, their productivity, that meetings overrun all the time. It's ridiculous. Like it's a genuine problem for many organizations across society, probably all of them. And what at a completely different, I'm just imagining being, often in those meetings, let's say there's 6 people. If you're not the person chairing the meeting or you're not the most senior person, you're usually not the sole cause of the meeting overrunning. Like sometimes you are, and like I have been, but they'll in that meeting, there's 6 people there. She's one of the people. At least one other person in that meeting is going, oh, I've really got to get home to take my daughter to the zoo, or I'm just tired, or there's this really other important thing going. And the sense of relief and joy in them when she shuts the meeting down
Yeah,
at 5:58 for a 6 o'clock finish or whatever it is will just be tangible.
yeah,
And like how funny it is that we don't do that. And I love the idea there that part of that is because she feels safe to do that. And partly
yeah,
that's because she knows that there's actually a higher risk for her. So it's like, just because this might feel like it keeps me safe now, I'm just spotting this. Just because this, like, doesn't mean that over the course of my life, it's a more safe way for me to, for example, live the life I want to be or be the mum that I want to be. Might be actually overall safety. We could think about this in different ways. Is better if I'm with my daughter at the zoo. But I also just got this flash. What I wrote down when you were telling that story is like, again, we get a sense of how important safety is. Like, what an incredible thing for anybody to do. I don't know if she does this, but I just got this flash that she might, especially the first time she's trying it, right? She's like, I've got to finish the meeting on time. Like this is ridiculous. It's got to stop. She's feeling probably this rush of fear, like, and then she could just slow down. She could say to herself quietly, I am safe. And what a transformational thing that is. If she can actually believe that, if I can actually believe and this is essentially my courage practice, right? With sharing things online that I talked about in the books and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
People can read about it on my website. Like in the end, it was like, no, look, I feel like it's a matter of life and death for me to post this thing online, but I am safe. What a difference if we can really value safety enough to truly believe that, then so much becomes possible for us.
And you're very perceptive, Robbie, because just now you said you sense that perhaps she regrets that situation that happened. And that's how it came about, actually, because when I can't even remember which value it was, but she was talking about how, oh, I think it was probably something like the value was family, and the practice was to prioritize family commitments over work. That was her practice. And then she shared with me this photograph, and she said, it makes me feel bad, like a bad mother every time I see that photograph. And I said to her, well, I kind of understand why you're saying that, but you do realize that you can look at it in a completely different way because now you've got this practice that is to prioritize family commitments. This can be your visual reinforcement of that. And so when you're sat in the meeting room and you've realized that it might overrun, and it's your practice today to prioritize family commitments, and you think of that photograph, there's no way you're going to allow yourself to be sitting there, right?
Right. I mean, I love that. So it reminds me of two things. I think that for me, discovering, I mean, it's partly the values that are important to me, but it's also how to actually live them. I think regret and guilt are incredibly powerful tools for doing that. There's almost nothing like been nothing like it in my life for knowing, you know, horrible, like, this is a relatively low cost one that's quite easy for me to talk about. There are harder ones to talk about, but I royally messed up a sales conversation with a client once. They were an existing client. We were talking about stopping or carrying on or extending, and I messed up that conversation so much that she has never replied to any of my messages since then. We've never been in touch again. Right. And it's tragic because the first bit of work we'd done was like magical for her. But that is an amazing reminder to me to, that no part of those conversations is worth jeopardizing a relationship. And that's how I know to live that value, of what would we call that value? I guess it's like, maybe it's the value of honor or something like that. For me, it's like, it's incredibly, like, to pursue money at the cost of relationship, which is essentially what happened in that conversation, is dishonorable for me, in my view. So never again. And you get that thing, and she can have that with that picture. I love this woman. Like, the idea that she's got that, keeps that picture on her desk forever as a reminder. And what an amazing thing for her daughter to know. I mean, her daughter probably had a great time at the zoo with the nanny, right? But like, no, my mum will never has got this thing on her desk so that this will never happen again. It's incredible.
Now, I'm conscious of time, and I can't believe the time has flown like it has. It's been a fascinating values jam, but we do have one final question to consider, and that is this. What are you encouraged to do differently about safety as a result of our conversation today?
I think it's that little affirmation that came up for me when you were speaking. That's there for me. I am safe. I think I'm gonna, and I know what it feels like for me. It's like tightness in my chest, shortness of breath. That's when I know that I don't feel safe. And so I'm gonna take that as a little affirmation to play with and practice and
And
see what happens.
when might you have the first opportunity to do that, Robbie?
Oh, I mean, I probably have it today, to be honest, Alan. Like, I get those moments, not all the time, but at the moment, got some stuff going on. We've got little kids, so I'm always tired. So we've got this, like, and I find that that's when stress affects me more. And there's just a couple of things going on at the moment that I know, for some reason, I'm not unsafe, but I feel unsafe, and I will have that, chance to take a deep breath and play with that affirmation. How
Yeah,
about you? Can I bounce that question onto you?
yeah, it's similar actually, and it's this thing you were talking about that financial conversation. For quite some years now, I've used the phrase "pay more disrespect to money," and it served me very well. And actually, because you're a football fan, I'll share how it kind of originated actually. So I'm a lot older than you, and the first World Cup that I remember was 1970 with the brilliant Brazil team, maybe the best national team ever. And that's what caused me to fall in love with football. So when we used to play football, we used to spend the last 15 or 20 minutes doing flicks and tricks, Brazil style, this sort of thing. I can't remember when the World Cup was in Brazil. Was it 2014, maybe? Something, I can't remember. Anyway, I was sat in my office in the spring thinking, the World Cup is in Brazil. Brazil is the reason you've fallen in love with football and enjoyed it for your whole life. So you should go. So the other voice said, you can't spend money on something like that. But I decided to go and told my family. And then Sam, who was then 17, as didn't do this, didn't ask this immediately, but after a while, he said, "Is there any chance I could come with you?" So that was quite difficult as a parent because I couldn't afford to take him and pay for him as well. I told him that, but said, you've got a job. He used to work at a supermarket at the weekend and one day during the week. So between now and I think it was in July, how much do you think you'd be able to save up to come along? So again, there was about a week period where we didn't talk about it. But then he said, "Dad, I've worked it out. I think I can make a contribution of £1,000." And I was blown away because basically he was willing to work harder to be there than I was. Relatively, he was making a far stronger commitment. So, of course, it wasn't enough to cover the trip, but I topped it up. And since that trip, we see each other regularly, but it's not very often it doesn't come up in conversation and will be a fond memory for both of us for the rest of our lives. So, how can you possibly put a financial value on that? And similarly in work, uh, hopefully I don't get abused for it by clients, but I tend not to have a rigid pricing structure because I just want us both to do what is right and works both ways. That sometimes is too idealistic and doesn't work, but I think it's worth it in the long run. So yeah, so for me, um, it is about this reminding myself how safe I am and that I am able to make those choices and decisions. So not very dissimilar. And as to when I'm going to put that into practice, I'm going to have a look at my calendar and identify some calls that I'm going to be able to use that in. Um, and I'm thinking there's one actually so it's an inquiry at the moment where I'm not sure whether I want to do the work or not. And this conversation is actually going to give me more strength to not do it if it's not right.
Mhm. Amazing. And I just love how this bit has kind of emerged in this conversation. This is what came up for me. I think this is my way of trying to capture it. It's like, um, this is a bit like one of the other things I love as well as football are fantasy novels. So I can come off a bit fantasy novel sometimes, or like Braveheart or something. He says something a bit like this, but it's like there are worse. Like we think about safety as being about material risk, and so like running out of money is a material risk that would be damaging for you and your family in that example of the World Cup. And yet, in the nicest possible way, there are some things worse than material risk and some things that are worth every material risk. And that memory for you and Sam that'll last a lifetime, your lifetime and beyond, his lifetime, potentially like he'll tell if he has kids, he'll tell them, it's like that will go on. And that it's, having the life that we could have. Like that's what's possible if we are like we can be too safe for that but also it's not. It's like it's the opposite. It's like this thing about safety that I've never really seen before. That it is so intrinsically linked that there are different kinds of safety. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, we could just, like you said, speak on for another hour for sure.
Yeah, it sounds. We started with the use of kickoff as a phrase, so I think it feels a bit like we've got to half time,
Yeah.
but, but we need to draw a close. So, Robbie, thank you so much for joining in with this. Thank you for choosing the card as well, because my perception of that value has changed considerably during this conversation, and so much for the better. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.